The summer of 1987 rolled in like a warm promise. Heat mirage on two-lane blacktop, the electric rasp of cicadas, and a lake so polished and blue it looked incapable of cruelty. That was the season 8 friends from Westfield College stuffed coolers, maps, and good intentions into 2 cars and pointed themselves south for one last weekend before rent, alarm clocks, and grown-up obligations demanded more than they could bargain away. They didn't return. No shattered rail washed ashore. No life jacket bobbed into a fisherman's net. No gasoline rainbow told a quick story on the surface. Rumor took over where evidence stopped. Headlines began as questions, softened into maybes, then disappeared into the quiet column inches where yesterday's news goes to rest. 6 years went by. What survived in the meantime were scraps and small anchors. A rental slip tacked behind a marina counter with a thumbtack gone rust brown. A pickup that reappeared month after month at the same overlook. A thin county folder that nobody marked closed, but nobody reopened with intent. The lake carried the weight. The town learned to walk around it. Then a dry spring in 1993 pushed the waterline down like a thumb on a scale. Sandbars blinked in the sun for the first time since the 60s. Dock pilings, long buried, pointed at the sky like knuckles. Cedar Lake changed its expression. It looked ready unwilling, but ready to give something back. They had been young and sure, in the way a circle of friends lets you borrow courage you don't yet own. Thomas Tom Keegan, 22, wore the unargued authority of the oldest. A mechanical engineering student, he packed order the way other people packed clothes. Spare plugs bagged and labeled, sockets nested by size, a pencil nub to note fuel burn on a pocket pad sealed in a Ziploc. Caution didn't make him timid. It made him trusted. Careful made him captain. Lauren Pike was the complimentary spark-quick grin, quicker decisions, the voice behind every plan that began with, "What if we just go?" Where Tom measured, Lauren leapt. She could talk a stubborn idea into motion and talk a hesitation back down the hill. Dave Rowan had been Tom's roommate for 3 years and had the unshowy steadiness of a person who never knocks anything over by accident. Rebecca Becca Salazar, a sociology major with a laugh librarians could set their watches by, met Dave in freshman ethics. Afterwards, their schedules and circles kept finding ways to overlap. Ellen Ward and Chris Avery were the photography club pair twin Nikons, 6 rolls of Kodak each, a running game of trading portraits and catching the other off guard with good light. They knew each other's silhouettes as well as their names. The twins, Marcus and Donna Ortiz, were Ridgemont kids. Parents owned a hardware store off the highway, under a tin awning that rang when the rain came hard. They had grown up with lake weather phrased in practical terms, what it did to rope, to wood, to the price of someone's weekend. The plan was modest and legible. Drive down Friday morning, rent a dependable boat from North Shore Marina, camp 2 nights along the shore, be home by Sunday evening with sunburns and a story. The week before, Tom spread a paper map of Cedar Lake on a scarred lounge table and walked them through the route like a pilot with a checklist. He didn't perform authority. He distributed it. Lauren christened the idea with a name, the Farewell Float. Someone scrawled it on a fresh Polaroid border, and the joke became a title. And the title made everything feel as real as a receipt. Friday, June 12th, rose clean and cloudless. At the marina, outboards growled themselves awake. Gulls argued about nothing specific. Pete Odell, the rental clerk with a retreating hairline and patient eyes, slid across the keys to a 24-foot runabout white hull. Blue trim, chrome still honest. Tom matched the registration numbers to the paperwork. Then he matched them again. Becca teased loud enough to carry 3 slips over. Lauren clicked the Olympus and caught Tom mid-squint. clipboard proud, already wearing the seriousness that keeps friends alive. Coolers thunked aboard. A canvas tent unrolled with the dry smell of last summer still in it. An old transistor radio, reliable when it felt like it. A brand new waterproof Olympus that Ellen swore could survive the apocalypse and still meter correctly. The boat nodded at the extra weight and accepted it. At 11:15 a.m., the lines fell away. The prop stirred the lake into a glimmering path. On shore, Pete raised a hand without thinking. 8 figures waved. Fleetwood Mac ran out over water, thin to a thread, then disappeared into the bright. That was the last sighting anyone could certify. What came after lived inside memory and possibility. A boat with the right colors, sliding past the South Bend, about 1 in the afternoon. A burst of laughter crossing water in the middle of the day like a skipping stone. A picnic blanket at Bracken Point. Someone shading eyes, pointing at a white fleck on the horizon. Nothing that smelled like threat. Nothing that demanded a second look. Then nothing at all. Phones did what they do. At the Keegan house, Michael Tom's younger brother answered questions phrased like fishing lines. Leading, patient, barbed. Lauren's mother refused to unplug the phone. Unplugging felt like shutting a door that a miracle might be trying to reach. The Ortiz parents drove the perimeter of the lake until gas receipts told their own strange story of devotion. Detective Donald Harrow was new to the chair, careful in the way of a man more afraid of overpromising than of missing a difficult truth. He wrote probable accident in a neat hand and explained on paper that sharp Saturday winds could have rolled the runabout and that the northern basin kept what it took. Unlikely to recover is the phrasing you use when your gut wants the word lost and your badge does not. 4 months later, somebody added the pencil diagonal that meant suspended, not closed, quieted. Michael did not learn the skill of letting it rest. He drove back to Cedar Lake as if the road between home and water needed to know he'd keep it worn. He brought folded maps, weather charts pinstriped with highlighter, a yellow pad. He traced the same 12 miles so many times the paper began to wear thin, where his finger always turned. Fishermen learned to recognize his pickup, even with the lights off. Grief, from the outside, can be mistaken for stubborn ritual. Folklore moved in to rent the empty space. Teenagers named a pocket of water the Sunken Cove, and dared each other to step too near. Hunters talked about lights drifting across the marsh on thin moon nights. Most listeners translated that back into fog playing tricks. Stories are a way to put handles on uncertainty. By the early 90s, the 8 became a small moral in a larger cautionary sermon about lakes and liquor and young men who think physics likes them. And still, some scraps refuse to fade. Pete's rental form behind the counter, the date circled, the signature precise. Thomas Keegan, the thin county folder, carefully block-labeled, Cedar Lake, 1987, boat 24S, blue trim. Then the drought pulled its quiet lever. On Sunday, April 18th, 1993, a garage tinkerer named Alan took his pickup to the bluff over the North Inlet. He cleared a space on the tailgate, spooled a little magnetic tape into his camcorder, checked the RC aircraft's patched wing twice, and launched. The crosswind had opinions. The wings wobbled, then obeyed. The lens panned patiently across square miles of gray, doing what lenses do, making a record without making a judgment. The lake looked plain and endless. Then something flashed from beneath like a blink. Alan finished his flight because that's the kind of careful he was. Later, in a garage that smelled like oil and cardboard, he paused the tape on a frame that raised the hair on his forearms. Under a skin of water lay a geometry of pale shapes. Not the chaos of drift. Rows, boats. Some long and narrow, some wide-bodied, some nearly complete. Others swallowed to their gunnels by slow silt. He rewound, replayed, zoomed, until VHS grain chewed the picture to chalk. Near the center, a hole with blue trim and a white deck tugged at his eye. The registration numbers came in and out of legibility like a radio station at the edge of range. Then, briefly, crisp. He slept badly. Dawn made him practical. The sheriff's office had to see what the tape could not keep secret by itself. The dispatcher called Sheriff Raymond Ellison and Detective Harrow. Ellison had learned how to carry skepticism without turning it into dismissal. He called things as he saw them, but he let the seeing be thorough. When the tape played big on the office wall, even he stopped finding polite alternatives, like flood junk and reflections. "Give me coordinates," he said finally. "We're going." By mid-morning, a patrol skiff pushed through reeds into the inlet. The motor coughed and settled. The water's color dropped a tone. Shapes began to appear. Faint, then exact, the way stars do when you stop trying too hard to force them into focus. 1, 2, dozens. They killed the engine. Sound receded to wind and frog, and the tiny noises boats make when they admit they're resting. Ellison shaded his brow. "I'll be," he said, without finishing the thought. Fishing skiffs, pontoons, a little cabin cruiser, a collection that looked curated rather than gathered by chance. Allen pointed. Ellison brought them alongside a 24-footer with the right blue, the right scars, the right neglected shine. Algae blurred lines, but numbers kept their stubborn honesty. AR 9824BL. Matches matter. They matched the form thumbtacked in Pete's office. They matched the notepad entry on Michael's kitchen table. At the nod, Harrow tied off and stepped aboard. The deck flexed. Water lapped over boots and pretended it had always been there. Silt kept a shallow catalog of lives interrupted. 2 crushed cans, a snarl of rope, a cooler wedged aft that had soaked up the smell of metal and old plastic. Harrow popped the lid. Inside a sealed bag, a roll of Kodak Gold 200, still tight. A compact cassette. Its label faded into a color without a name. "You'll want to see this," Harrow said. Ellison leaned and frowned. "Belong to anybody?" "Not this," Harrow answered, quiet. He rubbed the inside transom with his thumb where the algae thinned. 2 words cut into fiberglass crooked but deliberate, grooves dark with grime. "Help us," the reeds whispered. Time lengthened. Allen swallowed. "That's from them, isn't it?" Ellison's jaw settled. "Crime scene team," he said. "And call Keegan." By late afternoon, yellow tape shifted in the breeze. News vans idled heat into the air, and deputies stood knee-deep posing cameras at boats that had learned the lake's patience. Divers marked grids with flags that made the marsh look civilized in a way it had never agreed to be. Michael arrived with the road still on him and followed Ellison to the runabout without asking which one it was. A crescent dent near the bow made the choice. He put his fingers on it, the way he had the week before the trip when he and Tom sanded that spot smooth, and he didn't trust his voice to hold when Ellison asked the question you ask for the record. "I'm sure," he said. Harrow handed him the sealed bag. The yellow canister bumped the cassette like a heartbeat you could see, but not name. "We'll process both," Harrow said. "Could be leftover vacation." "Tom wouldn't leave them," Michael said. It came out flat and heavy and done. Under floodlights, the sling did its capable work. The hull rose out of suctioned mud, water sheeted away, and the carved plea caught hard light like a decision. "Help us." A sentence made of scratches. A sentence the lake had guarded, not erased. "We'll take it to Little Rock," Ellison said. "See what the film shows." Michael watched the dark water fold back into the absence the boat left. The smell of algae and gasoline made the moment sharpen into a point. Scent is a traitor. It will take you exactly where you were when you first learned to be afraid. For 6 years, Cedar Lake had kept its counsel. That night, it whispered something else into Michael's chest. This isn't finished. Little Rock. Later. The field lab lived in a basement that smelled like solvent, and a promise to quit smoking that didn't stick. Boxes leaned into corners. Evidence sleeves slept in long trays. Time did its best to make everything look ordinary. On a stainless counter, 2 small items waited, insufficient in size for their gravity. Janet Rowe did the work carefully enough that watching her felt like a kind of respect. Load the reel, seal the tank, pour the developer, agitate, count, stop, fix, rinse, breathe. The red safe light made everyone's skin look like they'd been carved out of their own pulse. Ghosts arrive as suggestions, and then decide to stay. The first frame surfaced, 8 faces on a bright dock, grins like unbroken glass. Tom in the center, eyes narrowed, arm around Lauren, other hand at a half salute that meant more to them than it ever would to anyone else. The runabout behind them gleamed like it believed in happy endings. The registration stood up straight. Janet clipped prints to a drying line 24 frames, orderly, lying about how time behaves. The first 18 documented a weekend you could sell on a brochure. Sandwiches, wet hair, horizon poses, Ellen catching Chris catching Ellen. The twins arguing with a tent pole the way all campers do at least once. Frame 19 put a crease in the air. Tom at the wheel, looking back over his shoulder. The new line between his brows, proof of a thought the camera couldn't hear. 20. Lauren leaning in, hand up against glare, mouth shaping a sentence the photograph couldn't hold. 21. A wide shot, empty water, nothing written in the sky to warn anyone of anything. 22. A white presence, far and closing. Under the enlarger's insistence, it declared itself a cabin cruiser. Bright, purposeful. Bow pointed in a line that did not suggest ambiguity. 2 figures at the front, just shape and posture against the blaze. "What's the time?" Sheriff Ellison asked from behind the glass. 3:47 p.m., June 13th, 87, Janet said, eyes flicking to the edge code. Michael felt numbers thud into the memory of Tom's last log line. 23. Tom pointing, mouth open. The others turning at once. Smiles erased. The easy day suddenly something else. 24. Tilted. Low. Overexposed. The look of a frame made by hands that had other priorities. A white streak across the lens where brightness insisted on being the story. "That's the roll," Janet said gently. "No tear. Some water stain. Whatever happened, happened after this." "Scan it," Ellison said. "Log it. Then, let's hear the tape." The compact cassette was a small rectangle you could lose between car seats or in the mouth of a couch. Ralph Denner loved machines in ways newer technicians had forgotten. He ran the tape through an analog deck, patched a reel-to-reel as backup, and gave the hiss its small space. A woman's voice, first clear, tightened by effort. "Tom, they're following us again." Tom, steady but far. "Same boat. Stay calm." Wind leaned on the microphone. Engine note lifted. Held. Another voice. Becca's words snatched into static and returned as tone without content. Lauren again. "Closer! They're closer!" Tom. "I'll push for the channel. Maybe they back off." Metal clattered. Footsteps. Voices laid on top of one another and thinned by the mechanics of tape. Then a second engine shouldered into the soundscape, deeper, nearer, not patient. Lauren's voice rose, pulled tight by fear. "Tom, they're right." A long whine tore the rest away. Then the end of reel ticked that small, cruel metronome that says the machine did its entire job and the world did not. No one spoke at first. Michael kept his jaw shut until words would come out as sentences, and not as something he'd regret. "That isn't weather," he said. Not loud. Very certain. "That isn't an accident." Ellison and Harrow exchanged the look of people deciding how much truth to say out loud before they can prove it to someone who doesn't want it. We'll run spectrum cleanup, Ellison said. Engine profile, RPMs, maybe distance. But he let the unfinished thing sit where everyone could see it. The line between speculation and certainty had moved. Front pages did what they do. Recovered film suggests foul play in 1987 Lake Mystery. The headline sold papers for a day. Then the world returned to its own gravity. For Michael, the film and the tape were not a period. They were the first blunt line in a map. He began to drive. A quiet Little Rock house first. Dave Rowan's parents kept a living room arranged around absence. Graduation portraits at angles you don't correct. Clippings stacked as if weight could keep hope in place. A missing poster laminated after it began to curl. Mrs. Rowan made tea and apologized for not remembering how much sugar he took, then apologized for apologizing. Did anything strange happen before they left? Michael asked. She stared at the cup and then at the window, as if the answer might be written backward on the glass. A phone call, she said. 2 days before. A man with a calm voice said he worked with the marina office. He asked if David had ever been on the policy before, and whether I could confirm his driver's license number for a liability file. She frowned. He sounded official. That's what I remember. Did he give a name? Brenner. Or Bennett. It's been years. The apology returned to her face. I didn't think it was important. Michael underlined Brenner once in his spiral notebook and put the pen down, because once was enough. In Texarkana, Becca's father wore the day's work on his hands and the last 6 years across his shoulders. When Michael asked about a break-in before the trip, the man laughed once with no humor in it. You want me to tell that to the same people who wrote probable accident and went home? He wiped clean paws with a rag until the rag was dirtier than the hands. Back door. Pry marks. Nothing missing. I changed the lock. I told myself it was kids. Ridgemont again. Mrs. Ortiz's clapboard house held twins across decades. Halloween costumes matched, prom tucks and dress coordinated. Fishing poles held like trophies. Her hair had gone white the way a good sheet goes white on a line in winter light. Her eyes had not dimmed. A man came by, she said when he asked. Said he was a marine safety inspector. Carl Brenner. Tan jacket, patches. He had a badge I didn't like. He asked where they were staying, what boat they planned to take, whether they'd filed disclosures. He said he'd see them at the marina over the weekend. She paused. I didn't call it in. I told myself inspectors come in all shapes. Michael stepped into sun that didn't feel warm. 3 contacts in 48 hours. A corporate affiliate in tiny print at the bottom of a contract. Lakeside Marine Recovery Capote. Insurance and Salvage Division. A Hot Springs listing that still answered phones. Mr. Brenner retired, a woman said, and ended the call in a way that made the word retired sound like, don't ask again. The shape of the thing clarified. Not an accident that wandered into legend. A system with rails and checkpoints, and a lake curated to look like fate. Michael brought his notes to Harrow. The blinds were the same. The map on the wall equally out of date. The coffee equally overboiled. Harrow's hair had more gray in it, and his eyes more patience than kindness. You're asking me to tie Brenner to a homicide with a handful of memories and a dissolved corporation, Harrow said, after the desk had been turned into a paper diorama. Strong claims belong to strong evidence. What about the Inlet? Michael said. The lineup. Somebody kept a private museum of accidents. You don't get that from bad weather and luck. If you grift insurance, you sink what complicates the math, recover what pays, and hide the inventory where only drought can tell on you. Maybe, Harrow said. But maybe doesn't get a warrant. And if you think you're doing this without backup, you're not just brave. You're being stupid. Brave looks like stubborn from far away, Michael said. Stupid looks like a funeral. I'm not asking you to like it. That night, the motel phone rang once and quit. Then again. and he let the machine do the talking. A flattened voice arrived, as if funneled through something that scraped the humanity off. "Stop looking, or you'll join them." A small whir. A click. The sound of a man trying to sound like an institution. The clerk swore no one asked for his room. Fear arrived, not as sprinting panic, but as the calm certainty of being positioned inside someone else's plan. Morning. Harrow listened to the message. "Prank," he said. And then, or not. He took a swallow of coffee he didn't want. "You made yourself visible, Keegan. That's both good and bad." "Do you know Brenner?" Michael asked. "By reputation," Harrow said after a fraction that mattered. "Back before we had proper teams, he was the lake. If someone went missing, Brenner knew where the bottom kept its secrets. So the man you hired to pull the dead from the water might have been the one arranging for the water to have more dead in it." Harrow's face set. "Choose your words." "I am." Michael left before he said the rest. That evening, lights slid across the inlet, where the recovered boat sat under quarantine. Deputies found the gate chain cut. Long gouges clawed the mud where hulls had been dragged. 3 boats gone. Somebody was erasing ledgers in a hurry. At dawn, Michael's motel door sat wrong in the frame. Nothing taken. Everything touched. His notes stacked neatly at the table's center. On top, a Polaroid face down. He turned it over and saw himself leaving the sheriff's office the previous morning, coffee in one hand, notebook in the other. 3 words in red across the white border. "You're next, sailor." Hands shook. Then they didn't. Fear and resolve often arrive together and are frequently mistaken for each other by onlookers. Brenner's house looked like clean money timber, glass, a view that laid down and obeyed. Fog rolled off the lake thick enough to edit sound down to insect hum. Michael parked out of sight, taped a flashlight lens red so the beam wouldn't flare, and walked the rest. The boathouse breathed varnish and oil. 2 boats waited, one sleek and current, one smaller, patched, honest, in a way that looked like guilt. A crescent moon dent at the bow told a story 100 times rehearsed. Michael climbed aboard. Under the stern seat, his hand found a leather folder gone soft with years. 8 names, each in neat hand, each crossed in sharp red. Thomas Keegan, Lauren Pike, David Rowan, Ellen Ward, Rebecca Salazar, Marcus Ortiz, Dana Ortiz, Chris Avery. Beneath 8 new names, Westfield students. Next month's weekend circled with optimism that curdled as he read. In the engine bay, an early GPS wired to an external battery. Behind a loose panel, fingers hit waxed paper, then metal. A mini cassette, label faded, but legible. TK, 6/12/87. Tires hissed on gravel outside. Headlights swamped the yard. Boots rasped planks. A flashlight sliced the dark into proof. Brenner's voice carried with the casual authority of a man who never had to repeat himself. "Unit 2, base. Boat's still here, same one. He must have been looking again." A pause that sounded like an ear to a radio. "No. Tom Keegan was the last who tried to play hero. We handled that. We'll handle his brother the same way if he keeps sniffing." Michael folded himself into the water under the dock and taught his lungs how to be patient. When silence returned, he left the way he arrived, soaked to the ribs, heart banging like hull on chop. First light. Harrow's office. Michael walked in with the cassette in his hand, and words already chosen, and froze. Carl Brenner sat across from Harrow with a coffee cup and a posture that said, "Welcome to the part where I pretend to help you." Harrow nodded. "Morning, Keegan. We're sketching a bait operation. You file a stolen boat claim. We draw out whoever's moving evidence. Mr. Brenner's advising, knows the lake better than anyone." Michael smiled like a man who understood the definition of theater. "Smart," he said, and took the file Harrow slid across. He nodded to Brenner. as if greeting a neighbor at a mailbox. Then he left to write his own plan with a pen that did not shake. 2 days later, he returned to Brenner's kitchen with an invitation in his pocket and a recorder clipped where habit hid it. The lake glittered in the glass. A revolver lay on the counter near a manila folder because some men love displaying their leverage. "You remind me of your brother," Brenner said, pouring coffee the precise way careful men pour coffee. "Same stubbornness, same mistake." "What mistake?" Michael asked. "Believing systems confess," Brenner said. "Tom learned what I do. Staged wrecks. Paperwork neat as a sermon. Payouts you could build a house on. He planned to walk it into the sheriff's office like truth was a VIP with a standing reservation. He didn't understand scale." Michael's thumb found the recorder. "You killed him." "I contained him," Brenner said, smiling with the wrong half of his mouth. "You don't let 6 years of work drown because a boy grows a conscience." He reached for the revolver. Michael drew first. The report cracked the room open. Brenner folded against the counter, left shoulder a spreading dark. Michael held the sight where it needed to be and dialed the number Tom had written in neat block letters on an index card. "FBI, Little Rock." "Federal Field Office," a woman said. "My name is Michael Keegan," he answered, breath even because he forced it to be. "I have evidence of multiple homicides tied to a marine insurance operation at Cedar Lake. Suspect Carl Brenner is alive, wounded, and on site. Send agents now." Brenner laughed through blood. "You think windbreakers don't take their cut?" "Then we'll name every cut in open court," Michael said. Sirens have a way of converting doubt into future tense. They grew and grew. Agents filled the house with procedure. FBI curved along backs. Commands turned adrenaline into ordered motion. Michael placed the revolver on the tile with 2 fingers and said, "Left shoulder." He confessed. They cuffed Brenner while he bled and smiled and told him the lake keeps secrets. Secrets are only safe until the drought comes. Evidence techs photographed, bagged, logged. Insurance folders. The list of names. The GPS unit wired where it shouldn't have been. The mini cassette marked with Tom's initials. Boxes acquired stickers. Stickers acquired a case caption that would teach itself to reporters' tongues. United States versus Carl A. Brenner, et al., number 93-207. Special Agent Linda Hart took Michael's statement twice. She did not soften when Tom's voice filled the small room. Calm, clear, young explaining staged sinkings, falsified salvage, accidents that existed to silence people who noticed too much. "If anything happens to us," Tom's voice said, "check the marsh north of Cedar. He hides wrecks there." By noon, headlines learned new verbs: charged, indicted, seized. Harrow's name appeared below the fold, and then above it. What began as a lake narrowed to a map of states. 17 accidents gained quotation marks nobody would remove again. Payouts crossed $12 million. Salvage reports carried signatures they shouldn't have. People who had co-signed learned what the word conspiracy feels like in a courtroom. Brenner pled. Fraud. Murder. Obstruction. Harrow and 3 more officials faced federal charges. Others looked at their lawyers and learned how fast immunity evaporates when the first man starts telling complete stories. And still, the water had more to say. In September, ground-penetrating radar converted rumor into coordinates. Searchers found 4 pits under 3 feet of silt and clay, each lined with fiberglass shards and rusted anchors, the kind of pragmatic grave a lake makes when men give it instructions. Divers surfaced with evidence bags that looked too light for the work they asked living people to do. Dental records and personal items, completed identifications that families had been trying to finish in their heads for 6 years. Tom and Lauren, Dave and Ellen, Becca, Marcus and Dana. Chris. The water gave them back one at a time because that is how closure is rationed. Recovery took 2 weeks. Cedar Lake shut down to everything but airboats, waders, and cameras. Yellow tape cut clean lines across marsh that did not believe in straight edges. News trucks found angles. Volunteers found jobs to do so their hands would not become witnesses against them. Michael stayed on the bank, day after day, because leaving felt like betrayal, and staying felt like a promise he wasn't allowed to break. When the last body surfaced, he didn't speak. He nodded, once, as if acknowledging a debt collected in the only currency the world had left. The funeral came in October, under a sky the color of a bruise. 8 caskets in a row simplify the human vocabulary. People looked down, because up was too large. They held photographs the way you hold fragile things, carelessly tight. Some listened to prayers. Some listened to the wind. A town that had learned to look away learned how to stand and face. Michael spoke exactly once. His voice carried the rasp you get when you've been up too long telling the same story, because if you stop, it will be rewritten by someone else. They wanted the truth buried, he said. The lake returned it. After the service, Agent Hart gave him sums and sentences that belong more to reporters than to brothers. Largest marine insurance prosecution in state history, she said, and listed numbers that did not refill anything that had been emptied. The winter that followed asked for new uses of grief. Michael took restitution funds and stubbornness and built something with edges, the Keegan Marine Safety Foundation. A small office in Little Rock, 2 rooms and a storage closet. A coffee pot that burned long and forgave easily. A whiteboard covered in the practical theology of waterborne evidence, what floats, what doesn't, how long, when to call state divers, how to photograph rope marks without lying to yourself with flash. They trained deputies who had lakes for beat partners and budgets that bought one good camera and a hope. On the wall behind Michael's chair hung a framed photograph. 8 friends on a dock, sun hard on water, none of them yet instructed by the idea that plans come with fine print. He didn't look at it to hurt himself. He looked to remember that people are more than the worst story you can tell about them. Every June, he returned to Cedar Lake. He parked at the North Inlet, where reeds had grown back as if nothing had ever been interrupted, as if water and sunlight could erase intention. He watched the surface until the wind put a living pattern on it. Sometimes he heard Tom again, under the tape, hiss that his memory added. They're following us again. And he answered quietly, a ritual without audience. Not anymore. The Foundation's plaque listed 8 names, carved clean. Under them an inscription that refused to be poetic, because truth didn't need decoration. The truth doesn't disappear because someone buries it. It finds its way to the surface. That autumn, Cedar Lake looked like glass. People said they could see the sky looking back at itself. For the first time since 1987, the water seemed to be keeping only the ordinary secrets lakes are allowed. But stories don't end because we choose a graceful stopping place. Sometimes they acquire echoes. Reporters came looking for the epilogue. Where are they now? Pieces with soft light and grateful nods. They wanted to film Michael standing at the inlet and to cut away to archival footage of boats lifted in slings. He learned how to say no in a tone that kept friends and discouraged tourists. Some stories can be told again. Some should be left to rest. The Foundation kept busy without fanfare. County by county, Michael learned how often small departments wrestled with big water and small resources. He saw what an extra camera battery can mean when you're losing light at a scene that will never be this untroubled again. He wrote checklists. He taught how to tag line, how to grid, how to let a current tell you where it took a thing when it was instructed to take it. He also learned how memory changes shape under pressure. Families came with boxes the size of grief and asked questions that had no sentences for answers. He became a witness to other people's storms and tried not to mistake weather for climate. One evening, months after the trial, he found an envelope without a return address leaning against the foundation's front door. Inside, 3 photographs, boat hulls in water, gone to bronze by evening light. On the back of each, a place name in block letters he did not recognize, and a date that made his mouth go dry. Beneath the stack, a single line in ink the color of dried blood. Accidents don't line up in rows. He showed the images to Agent Hart the next morning. She studied them without telling him what she thought, before she had time to confirm it. "We'll check," she said. "It might be nothing. It might be someone trying to make a pattern out of noise. Or it might be what it looks like." Michael walked back to the office and stood under the photograph on his wall and told himself, out loud, which is sometimes the only way to hear it, that he had built the foundation to help answer difficult questions, not to carry every new one alone. The years after, time taught Michael to breathe differently. He learned how to say the name Brenner in a tone that didn't set his teeth on edge. He learned how to sit across from a young deputy and explain, without drama, why you always photograph a knot before you unknot it, why rope tells a story if you speak its language, why boats don't just vanish. Not really, not entirely. Not without someone writing the absence. He also learned which parts of the night would always belong to old sentences. The phone that rang once and stopped. The second ring that came 30 seconds later. The Polaroid of himself with the red thread on the border. These were not ghosts in the cinematic sense. They were simply parts of a man's life that had been recorded onto him, the way time records itself onto film, with chemistry and intention and a little luck. On the first anniversary of the trial's end, he received a letter with a return address from a town he didn't know. Inside was a page torn from a ledger, the kind marinas use when software fails and pens are faster than mice. 4 boat entries carried a small dot in the margin. At the bottom, a note in a different hand. Check the North Marsh. Same man, same method. New badge. He called Agent Hart. They drove down 2 days later and found a marina with a counter that knew too many elbows, and a clerk who had learned the careful speech of someone hired after a scandal they had nothing to do with. The ledger was real. The dots were real. The North Marsh was only a marsh, as far as daylight could tell. But Michael made the call he had trained for others to make. Grid it. Photograph it. Let the water answer in its own time. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes, not yet. Sometimes, yes. Back to the beginning, that wasn't an ending. The first days after the arrests taught the county unpleasant lessons about scale. The fraud ring had not been a single man's improvisation. It had been a system with budgets and calendars. It had roots in counties Michael had never driven through, and in offices where carpets ate footsteps. If you thought the story ended when a man in a tan jacket went to prison, you had borrowed your hope from a cheaper story. Court documents tied the staged sinkings to payouts, spaced in a rhythm that suggested payroll. Salvage reports carried signatures and co-signatures that belonged to people elected to be careful. A Coast Guard officer found his name in a paragraph and learned, in public, how a career can turn into a past tense before lunch. The insurance commissioner's office released a statement with sentences so polished they reflected nothing. Michael read the papers and kept his mouth shut because he had learned when his voice helped and when it made a better headline than a difference. People asked him, gently, and not, what forgiveness looked like in a town so small that nobody stayed a stranger. He learned how to answer without preaching. Forgiveness, he said, is a word you use when you need a bridge and there's no lumber left. Justice is when the invoices match the work and the graves have names. He did not pretend to own either word. He went back to work. North Shore, revisited. Pete Odell kept the rental form pinned behind the counter for months longer than anyone asked him to. He said it made him double-check life jackets. He said it made him slow down the part of the job that grows careless because it is repeated. He did not say, though anyone could have supplied the sentence, that it kept 8 faces present in a room that smelled like outboard oil and sunscreen. When Michael stepped in one late afternoon to return a borrowed skiff he'd used to teach a class on shoreline search, Pete nodded at the paper without looking at it. "I thought about taking it down," he said. "You don't have to choose today," Michael said. "I don't have to choose today," Pete repeated, as if relieved to be given permission not to suffer on a schedule. "Sheriff Ellison." The old man retired the following spring. He practiced being a civilian by sitting at the back of church and letting other people make announcements. Michael visited once and found him in a yard that looked like it had always been waiting for someone to have the time to know it well. "Do you ever stop playing back the tape?" Michael asked, meaning more than audio. Ellison shook his head. "You learn to lower the volume," he said. "That's all. Harrow." People asked Michael whether he hated the detective who had written "probable accident" in the neat hand. He answered carefully and honestly. He hated the decisions. He hated the consequences. He hated that Harrow had been able to sit across from him and drink coffee, while Brenner smiled 3 feet away. Then he stopped using the word hate for a man who had already found a narrow life on the other side of courthouse walls. The law had named the thing it could. Michael let the rest be named by time. The cassette labeled TK 6-1287. Chain of custody delivered Tom's pocket tape to evidence storage, and, eventually, to a listening room. Michael was allowed to sit in with headphones the size of his hands. He heard his brother's voice again. Closer, younger, the vowel sounds of a man who had not yet learned to be careful in speech the way he was careful in everything else. Tom narrated what he didn't yet call a crime. He described boats taken out in fair weather and brought back in broken lines on purpose. He described a man with a homemade badge and a real voice for authority. He described a pattern that only becomes visible when you stand elsewhere and look back. Michael listened until the technician pointed at the clock and made the universal gesture for "we have to lock up now." He took off the headphones and discovered that his hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Love had done some of the stabilizing work. So had rage. So had 6 years of teaching himself to speak without breaking the room. A call that did not come. There are days you think the past will dial you again and instruct you with a distorted voice. That call did not come. The thing that came instead was quieter, a kind of peace that arrives like fog, not like parade. Michael learned to recognize it by its absence. A brief word about lakes. They are not malicious. They are not kind. They are places where gravity and shape negotiate. If you want a lake to keep your secrets, you had better be prepared to pay it in attention and in silence. Drought is a poor creditor. It collects with interest. Cedar Lake learned to be ordinary again, and never entirely succeeded. On some mornings, if you stood on the bluff and looked just wrong, the way you can look at an old scar and remember the accident more than the healing, you could see rows where the water insisted there were none. The human eye makes patterns rather than be asked to admit ignorance. Michael learned not to argue with his eyes. He asked better questions. A different ending that is not an end. If stories like this keep you attentive, if you feel your heartbeat lean forward when a case refuses to stay buried, then you already understand why Michael kept returning to the Inlet year after year to listen for a voice he would never hear in air again. "They're following us again," the remembered line said. "Not anymore," he answered. Epilogue folded into the middle. The foundation outgrew its first office. Volunteers showed up who knew how to run lines without tangling a shoreline, who knew how to log evidence without making the future curse them. Michael hired one, then another. He learned to delegate without letting go of the part of the job that made him feel useful, which is always the hardest part to surrender. A reporter with better manners than most asked him, on the record, whether he believed in closure. He thought about the word and how clean it looks from a distance. "I believe in doors," he said finally. "Some close. Some don't. Some you close and then open again to be sure." He did not add the sentence he thought most nights, that grief is not a door. It is a room you learn how to live in with the windows open. A detail that didn't matter, and also did. On the foundation plaque beneath the 8 names, a small nick in the metal, barely visible unless the afternoon sun found it, looked like an accidental crescent. Michael noticed it once and smiled a little because it resembled the dent near the bow on Tom's boat, the one that had anchored memory to metal. He said nothing about it. Not everything that matters demands a sentence. A word to the listener. If you've come this far, you understand that the story was never about a single villain or a single act of courage or a single discovery. It was about the ways systems hide inside other systems and how drought of water, of patience, of excuses reveals the shape underneath. It was also, simply and irreducibly, about 8 people who laughed on a dock one bright morning and expected the world to keep its bargain. They deserved that. Michael kept living in a way that honored the debt. When you tell this story aloud, leave air where air belongs. After, they did not return. After, that was the last sighting anyone could certify. After each time you say a name in the list of 8. After, help us. Let the silence do some of the work. After the sentence that ends with, "This isn't finished," before he began to drive. After, accidents don't line up in rows. After, the water gave them back one at a time. After, they wanted the truth buried. The lake returned it. After the question about closure. And at the very end, after, don't miss what surfaces. Let the echo belong to the listener. Names used in this retelling, changed and consistent. Thomas, Tom Keegan, Lauren Pike, David, Dave Rowan, Rebecca, Becca Salazar, Ellen Ward, Chris Avery, Marcus Ortiz, Dana Ortiz, Sheriff Raymond Ellison, Detective Donald Harrow, Pete Odell, Alan, R.C. Hobbyist, Special Agent Linda Hart, Carl Brenner. Closing cadence. Stories like this aren't finished by verdicts. They're paused by paperwork and carried forward by people who refuse to let the next quiet lake be mistaken for innocence. If you found yourself leaning in, if you felt the room tilt when the mini-cassette clicked to life, then you understand why some of us keep returning to shorelines. Not to haunt them, but to make sure the next carved plea doesn't have to wait 6 years for drought to do a detective's work. Cedar Lake lies flat again. Summer kids skim the surface with rented paddles. The inlet hums the small life of reeds and insects. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. Water is good at that. It puts mirrors where we'd prefer windows. It returns us to ourselves. Michael still goes back every June. He doesn't always walk all the way down. Sometimes he stands by the fence and studies the place where access ends and memory begins. He knows now what he didn't in 1987, that the problem with endings is that they arrive disguised as pauses. He listens, out of habit and love, for the line the tape gave him once. They're following us again. He answers, because ritual is a kind of promise kept, not anymore. If cases like this pull you to the edge of your seat, press subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more forgotten files, stranger recoveries, and deeper waters ahead. Don't miss what surfaces.